It's my pleasure to introduce Baroness Pauline Neville Jones, the Shadow Minister of Security in the United Kingdom. Pauline Neville Jones has been a Conservative peer in the British House of Lords since October 2007. In the Opposition Shadow Cabinet, she holds the post of Shadow Minister for Security and is also National Security Advisor to David Cameron, the leader of the Opposition. From 2004 to 2007, she was Chairman of the Information Assurance Advisory Council, IAAC, and from 2002 to 2005, Chairman of the Kineti Q Group PLC, a publicly quoted defense technology company with government customers in the UK and US, and from 1998 to 2004, she was the International Governor of the BBC, with responsibility for external broadcasting. She was also Chairman of the Audit Committee. Previously, she was a career member of the British Diplomatic Service, serving, among other places, in Singapore, Washington, D.C., the European Commission in Brussels and Bonn. She was a policy planner in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and in the Cabinet Office served as a Foreign Affairs Advisor to Prime Minister John Major, and Chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee in Whitehall, 1991 to 1994. As Political Director in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, she was leader of the British delegation to the Dayton Peace Conference in Bosnia in 1995. Without any further ado, Baroness.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jonathan, thank you very much for that extremely kind introduction. In the UK, there's a dog show takes place every year, organised by an organisation called Crufts. And in that dog show, they choose the best of breed. Best of breed is, I think, an understood phrase. This conference is the best of breed, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm extremely pleased to do that. The subject matter of this conference, I think, has relevance for everybody in this room. It obviously has particular relevance for Israelis, since Israel's always had to deal, really, since the beginning of her history, with the threat of terrorism. And this country has been constantly challenged by both state and non-state actors. So this is a country with a very considerable experience, which no doubt has touched all families. And I have to say that in the face of these threats, the Israeli people have demonstrated the most extraordinary, remarkable, principled courage, and also resolve. And I think there's much that we can, all of us, learn from Israeli experience. And it's our unfortunate fate now, a lot of us, to be having to learn precisely from this experience. And I've no doubt also that Israel in this general situation can learn from others, and that's the importance, obviously, of this conference. Because as we're aware, and I think increasingly aware, the threat that we face is a common one, and it's not something that can be tackled in isolation, either in isolation from the context in which it finds itself, from the policies that are pursued in related fields, or indeed the policies that are pursued by neighbours and allies. Because we're all actors, and we have to realize that our responses themselves influence the course of events. No, this is not a situation in which we have terrorism out there, which is not in any way influenced by how we respond to it, and we can give it a good response and we can give it a poor response. And we have to learn from mistakes, recognize mistakes and learn from them. So the last thing I would say, obviously, and again, the importance of a conference like this is there is a lot of good practice that's developing, some of it very good, and there are other areas where there are weaknesses. We need to listen to each other and we need to learn. Also, finally, for somebody like a practitioner like myself, and I hope going to be in government soon, there's a great deal that we can learn from other communities. And I'm one of those who in my career has spent quite a lot of time in contact with the academic community. I respect it. I think there's a very great deal the practitioners in government can learn from academic and other analysts. And we also, finally, between us, I think, are the better for international cooperation and international analysis. None of us, I think, we've got past underestimating the challenge we face. And the UK most certainly does not underestimate it. And certainly in my party we don't. And we, of course, are a country, as you have heard this morning, which is faced by the challenge of a homegrown terrorist threat. And we saw on 7/7 how this abused and challenged the security of an open society, a society that we pride ourselves on possessing and wish to continue to have. And we have been challenged by a number of attempted attacks, and a number of individuals, groups, and plots are currently under investigation by our security service. But this homegrown threat is not just a challenge to the UK. It's also a direct threat to the security of others and to the security of our allies. And we have to recognize when something happens on our soil, just as it does in other countries, that it doesn't just affect that community. And this audience in particular will remember the harrowing suicide attack in Tel Aviv in May 2003. And the bomber and his accomplice were British citizens. And that's not the first time that terrorism has been exported from the UK. London-born Richard Reed, who was an al-Qaeda sympathizer, tried to carry out a suicide attack on a Paris to Miami airliner in December 2001. And in January 2002, Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh masterminded and kidnapped the murder of the US journalist Daniel Pearl in Pakistan. Somebody mentioned that this morning. And today, British citizens continue to travel to Afghanistan to support the Taliban and al-Qaeda in attacks against NATO forces of our allies. Secondly, the UK faces a challenge from abroad. The Director General of the UK Security Service has noted that the number of conspiracies in the UK being driven from overseas has increased dramatically over the last 12 months. And of course, there is an interactive process going on. So how should we, and I say we when I mean we, not just we UK, we British, but actually we in this room and more widely, how do we respond to this violent threat? Well, evidently we must cooperate internationally. We need to intervene through effective and efficient use of our police forces, our intelligence agencies, our security services, our legal frameworks, our diplomatic tools, our military capabilities, both at home and abroad, and the organizations of the kind that the previous speaker was talking about. And we need to protect our critical assets and improve our resilience. And crucially, there needs to be coherence between our pursuit and protection of efforts and aims and the techniques of our prevention strategies. The tools used to pursue and protect must not go against our democratic values. In the long term, prevention is achieved through the nature of the society we build. This is very important in the UK context, and I shall say something about this a bit later. The very values of democracies must rightly impose limitations on the methods we use to safeguard them. It's something I think we have to recognize and accept. As Aaron Barak wisely said, and I quote, "At times democracy fights with one hand tied behind her back, and despite that, democracy has the upper hand." But this requires sustained, courageous, and clear-sighted political leadership. So how has the UK responded to the terrorist threat? Well, it's obviously important for government to be well organized. Ultimately, it's the quality of policy that counts, and by themselves, structures cannot guarantee this. But clearly, good organization can be helpful to good policy, as well as to the good outcome, and of course the reverse is true. And on the whole, in the UK, we don't go in for big bureaucratic change. We have not, for example, instituted a Department of Homeland Security. And when in office, I doubt the Conservative Party will do this. We shall, however, continue some of the well-founded changes that the present government has made. And these include the extensive development of an integrated police, intelligence and security service model. Through this model, the services set joint objectives and agree investigative strategies. and they work together at all stages of domestic terrorist investigations. And it is a model of best practice. Unlike the US, the FBI model, which is slightly different, we have not gone for putting the intelligence and law enforcement functions together. In the UK, they remain separate. On the other hand, we have been early in the development of what was referred to in a previous session as fusion centers. Our so-called JTAC, the Joint Terrorism Analysis Center, tries to ensure timely and coordinated use of all available intelligence. And we also have other sections in our Home Office, our Interior Ministry, which relate to how we deploy some of our soft power policies. Well, when we get into power, the Conservative government will make two further changes to structures with direct relevance to terrorism. Now, I'm going to mention them just briefly. We have at present very fragmented border control with no less than 22 agencies. And the current government have made some moves in the direction of rationalization, and the Conservative government will cut through that and create a single armed border police force for land, sea and air. And secondly, and this will be an important innovation, we will create at the heart of government a National Security Council. Now, some people may be surprised that we don't have this already, and indeed we should. And as my speech will illustrate, the responses to terrorism have to take place both at home and abroad. Action in both has to be mutually supportive and compatible. And a very large number of agencies have to contribute to policy formulation and implementation. And though we recognize the necessity for this, we do not yet, in our view, have the machinery to implement the concept sufficiently well. Well, so much for government organization. Our first aim is effective investigation leading to prosecution. But the value of this is much reduced if the legal framework within which it takes place is either weak or inappropriate. And I'm much less happy about this aspect of the UK scene. Many traditional freedoms of speech, of association, and of the person have been nibbled away at over the last few years in the name of greater security. But the further government moves down this path, in which freedom and security can so easily become part of a zero-sum game, instead of supporting each other, the more incumbent it is upon government to justify its proposals by convincing demonstration of need. In the UK, we are currently considering the Counter-Terrorism Bill. This is one of several we have had. The Conservative Party considers that the proposal to extend pre-charge detention to 42 days maximum does not meet this criterion of demonstrated need. It's already, I might say, ladies and gentlemen, at 28 days, which is the longest in the free world. And we will continue to oppose this provision. We do, on the other hand, think that strengthening policy and, if necessary, the legal framework to curb the activities of extremist organizations and individuals is essential. I'll say no more about this later, but our criticism of the Labour government is that they have been too keen to curb general rights and not assiduous enough in preventing abuse and exploitation of those rights by extremists. Let me say a word about the importance of two other aspects of our ability to deal with terrorism: the resilience of critical assets and the extent to which we organize and practice recovery techniques for when disaster does strike. Now, in seeking to achieve their aims, terrorists do not only cause loss of life. They can damage the morale of society in other ways, and the destruction or the disruption of things like transport hubs, water systems and other key assets that underpin our daily lives can severely diminish popular confidence in political leadership, as well as causing, obviously, very significant material loss. So we have to be well informed about our vulnerabilities. We have to map them, and we have to ensure that we do our best to protect them against attack and recover functionality in event of attack. And this can only be achieved if government and the private sector, as well said earlier on, work together. And in all countries, I would suggest, an informed and active citizenry, capable and trained to help disaster recovery, would be a huge national asset. And I think Israel has something to teach us all in that regard. The fact that climate change and other hazards push us in the same direction only increases the argument for sustained effort in these areas. I want to say a word now about international response to violence. Our domestic activities have to be matched by compatible actions abroad. This is the point of the National Security Council. Actions that reduce the capacity for terrorist networks to flourish and to operate across boundaries. Now, a plot, after all, can be fermented in one country, trained for in a second, backed up in a third, and executed in a fourth. And perpetrators will then try to flee to a fifth. So as in the domestic context, it starts with information. Intelligence cooperation with counterpart agencies lies at the core of effective response. And our aim must be to disrupt individual plots and prevent terrorists becoming so organized that nothing short of the use of military means will succeed in rooting them out. It's become clear that the path to a peaceful and free society is infinitely harder and more costly to find if military force has had to be used. We have lost ground if we have to intervene militarily. The first chance for timely and effective response has already been lost. Moving to the second, state building, often during conflict situations, is much more costly, dangerous, and speculative. Under that head, I would say, we're currently not doing well in large parts of the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, and North Africa, where the threat continues to grow. It is clear, for the foreseeable future, the option of using military means to pursue and disrupt terrorists is one we must retain. And we will need to use it from time to time, sometimes for extended periods. And Afghanistan is a case in point. Al-Qaeda has been able to re-establish it in the tribal areas along the Afghan-Pakistan border. And we had some very sobering information this morning about that. And it maintains a capacity to plan sophisticated attacks. This has to be contained and subsequently eliminated. And it will remain a policy priority of a Conservative government in the UK. But we must recognize that at home and abroad, terrorist movements operate with long time horizons and reckon to sit us out. Democracies are impatient. Those populations who are willing to support the presence of terrorists in their midst, who are intimidated into supporting them, or who are just conniving at their presence, have to be persuaded that their interests lie elsewhere. Our aim should be to achieve this, war before force and intervention are the only options. I'm talking not just about the ability to blacken the reputation of the terrorist, but to make our own formally attractive. I'll come back to that. Now, in this context, I want to say just a few words about the dangers to democratic societies of extremism per se. Violence is the product of a wider extremist ideology, an ideology which is opposed to liberty. And I use the word ideology advisedly. It's opposed to tolerance, and it's fundamentally undemocratic. The very openness of democracies, their most important and attractive attribute, lays them exposed to being exploited and extinguished by those with very different social aims. And this is the strategic challenge we face. Tackling extremism successfully, in my view, is more difficult than the violent variety. It is less obvious, and it is more contentious in its policy outcomes and its policy methods than targeting its violent manifestations. But I maintain that it's vital. Because the more extremist ideology spreads in our communities, the harder it is to maintain a united and open society. And the more it will act as a conveyor belt leading people to violence. Now, those who espouse extremist ideology are adept at creating and exploiting linkages between fundamentalist goals and local and international conditions. Now, some linkages are plainly false. Some are grossly exaggerated. But the narrative of grievances has sufficient plausibility that it cannot just be brushed aside. And while I'm not so naive as to think that if all points of conflict in the Middle East were resolved and grievances remedied, current terrorism would cease. But it's also the case that our inability or unwillingness to ease, if not solve, long-standing points of tension, increases the risks we run, acting, as they do, as a recruiting sergeant for terrorism. And it reduces our capacity to bring about sustainable security. Turning to the domestic scene briefly, I want to say a bit about extremism there, because it's a very live issue in the UK. In the UK, we find that it's pretty hard to stop activities of individuals and groups which avoid using violence and keep within the letter of the law, but whose aims are not ones we share, and which are opposed to the values of democracy. It's almost the case of fighting an invisible subversion. Now, the ultimate solution lies in the kind of society we build. Sharice Maher this morning had a great deal to say about this, and I'm not going to cover that ground, but I agree very much with what he said, and also what he said in questions and answers about the problem we have in the UK, I think, at the moment, in the sense of our common identity and how we need to build that. And in doing that, we need the support, the active support of responsible citizenry. And we need, as I say, a citizenry in which people are able to identify themselves, but in which their primary loyalty is to their fellow citizens and to the state with which they identify. So how do we achieve this? First, we need to understand and counter the processes of radicalization. And secondly, we need to encourage mainstream Muslims, and it is Muslims we're talking about mainly, to speak out at all levels of society, but especially locally, where they are the ones who are aware of what is going on in their midst. Government has a key role in facilitation. It must deny public funding to extremist organizations. It must not give self-appointed groups whose motives and activities are questionable privileged access to government and policy making. It must keep divisive and inflammatory preachers out of the country. It must vigorously apply anti-incitement legislation against violence and terrorism. It must not maintain a false distinction between the social or charitable and military wings of organizations like Hezbollah and Hizb ut-Tahrir. These extremist organizations must be banned in their entirety. And finally, to actively encounter radicalization, we must have confidence in the democratic ideology of our own society and, as I say, in our national identity. Now, I fully recognize that creating a united response across communities to counter radicalization and promote integration will take time, and this is one of the respects in which we must accept that countering terrorism is the long haul. And there are hard, practical questions to answer. How do we engage with diverse Muslim communities? And they are communities. We do not ask people to forego their religion. But how do we encourage moderate Muslims to engage in the theological debate going on within Islam and for its soul? How do we establish some agreement on foreign policy questions and on the proper way to resolve disagreement? Now, tackling these and other questions will be a priority for any UK government, and certainly for a Conservative government. Finally, just a word about tackling non-violent extremism when it comes to abroad. Now, the Conservative Party has thought about the overall policy framework and the need to tackle extremism abroad. I come back again to the need for the right machinery in government. But, essentially we believe in the value of an open society. And we don't think that it's limited to geography. We don't think it's the special possession of only certain kinds of society. We don't think that only certain parts of the world are capable of having its benefits. And by an open society, I mean one that has the rule of law, the freedom of press, the freedom of expression, and the tolerance of peaceful difference. And the Conservative government will not seek to use force to impose these on others, but we do want to help implant them more widely around the world. We regard it as being a proper and laudable foreign policy aim. And foreign policy should be part of our counter-terrorism strategy. And we believe that political and social reform over time, as well as economic development, which gives ordinary people a stake in their own societies and the right to participate in their own politics, are the best solutions to extremism. And we will therefore help foster this in other countries on a partnership basis. And we believe this long-term approach to be an integral part of a timely and efficient response, which is, ladies and gentlemen, what we were asked to talk about. And it follows from what I've said that though we would like such a partnership to have wide scope and involve on an equal basis political actors in the region, we will not engage with those whose aims and methods continue to be violent. We do believe you need to draw lines. And we will not engage with those who talk peaceful action in one context and violence in another, and such organizations exist. We will not be deluded into doing so just because they have got there via the ballot box. Now, I know there are circumstances when it's opportune to have contacts with terrorists and terrorist organizations, but let us keep our heads screwed on about when this is likely to be useful, under what terms and conditions it should take place. Dialogue has to be conditional on behavior and sustained commitment to undertakings. Now, there's much talk in the UK about the virtues of engagement, and I'm certainly not against it, far from it. But I am wary of allowing oneself to be deluded by the motives of the interlocutor or the possible outcomes. And one of the few assets legitimate government has to convey on others by their contact is legitimacy. And we should not bestow this very valuable asset on the wrong sets of people. Well, in conclusion, let me just end by reiterating that while we need military capability and will use force when needed to tackle terrorism, the use of force is not the complete answer, and certainly as seen from Europe, likely to be ineffective if used in isolation. A comprehensive approach in the senses used by both the military and laymen is indispensable. And I've tried to set out what I think some of these other measures should be. We need to strengthen the machinery of government to enable us to act compatibly at home and abroad in ways which are consonant with the values we proclaim. And we need to cooperate with each other, not just in the technical fight against terrorism through such things as intelligence cooperation, but in the broader policies too. And when we are out of step, we cut across each other. And when we cut across each other, we weaken the overall effort. So we need to recognize that lying behind the men of violence is an ideological challenge to our way of life, which has to be tackled in its own right. And until we do this effectively, by the sophisticated long-term prosecution of our values and their active cultivation across our societies, we will not succeed. The radical fundamentalism which sustains the terrorists who act in its name, is one of, if not the biggest, challenge of our age, and we must rise to meet it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.